So welcome to Christmas at the Hormans in one of our rare daylight videos. Today we're going to do a little bit of a behind the scenes tour. So we will kind of go from left to right and then go to the back and then scoot over back towards the left again. So just looking at it from an overall perspective, you can see that we have an info board with our donates right there. We have our countdown clock, which is normally counting down the days until Christmas. Right now it's counting down into New Year's. We have our arches in the front. At the end over there we have our tunnel, which we'll take a look at. We then have our ground elements, which consist of stars and our mini trees. We then, flipping back over on this side, have our lovely snowmen. Kind of reaching back, going back into behind us is our big old MegaTree, our first MegaTree. You can see there's a house outline. The windows, the 4 windows on the edges of the house are done. Then we also have our big grid. And then way over on the other side, we have an info board above the garage. And then we have our last MegaTree, call it MegaTree over there too. And of course I forgot the elements on top of the garage as well. So in reality, we just like this here is a P10 panel. We actually have 3 of these that are P10. That one's P10. That other one there is P10. On the other side of the tunnel, which you can't see, there's a P10 panel going out so that traffic down this way gets some information about what radio to listen to. Also tells them not to block any driveways. And then in the very front of the tunnel is an information board as well. That was the only one that's a P5 that's brand new this year. So let's take a little bit of a look. So what we can see here is the first thing we have is our donation box, which is really simple. It takes food and also cash donations. Cash donations is sitting inside there right now. We have a light that is comes on. Then that one is actually controlled by a Shelly plug. So we use an MQTT signal when the show starts and stops in order to trigger that plug. And there's a dedicated wire that runs all the way back along to the side of the house to our Shelly system. So if we look at our arches, our arches are basically some 1-inch coral, 1-inch Plex tubing. And then we have they're held up by just some PVC, which has been painted a darkish color. I think it was supposed to be black, but it really didn't turn out to be black. And then each one is numbered, and then these are daisy chained together. Now, this still runs from one of the oldest controllers that we have, which is an old Alpha Pix3 controller. This was our bread and butter when we started converting to pixels, and we used this for quite some time. But today we'll see some F-16s, and then now our standards are the Falcon Pi players. But you can see that when it comes to building control boxes, my approach is quite simple. They're just plastic containers that, and there's a power supply. And then the only real trick that we do, is you might be able to see it from here, is make sure we put little drain holes on it. So that gives us the ability to allow it to breathe so that condensation doesn't build up as much, as well as if water does get in there, that it can drain out before it causes any real damage. But we don't go for those super expensive, super complex control boards, or control boxes I should say. So that runs all the way across over there, and then you can see that there's another box down at this end. That box just has power. So this one controls the first 3, and then that one has power for the next 3, and then the Alpha Pix3 is sending the control signal down all of them, and they're all daisy chained off of just one channel. So just off of one port. So there's actually now 3 unused ports, although we've had a number of times over the years where one of these has failed because they're daisy chained together, and then we just do a hot wire where we just take and add another wire to a port from wherever it's failed down into that. So it does make it nice having a few extra spare ports available to us. You can see that again, we just basically are covering. We have 3 wires coming across. One is the power wire for our donate sign. The other is a data cable, and then power for the archers, and they just run across and then chivvy all the way back to the house here. So now here you can see our countdown clock. This was actually, or at least the bottom half, was the first thing we ever did in Pixels. So this is our 24th year doing this in the end of 2024. So, but this is our 24th year with a computer controlled display. We used to do all incandescent bulbs with relays. The first thing we built with Pixels was this element down here, which it might be a little bit difficult to tell with the light, but it's scrolling some information, like it says seconds to go and gives you a phone number you could text your name to. For the last, well, I don't know, I think this one is what, 4 or 5 years old now. This top half is also a countdown clock, so it's got a 7-segment display, but it's just pixels that are in the segments. And so this is counting down right now the number of seconds until New Year. Normally it's the number of seconds until Christmas, because we have a big party outside our house and the clock hits 0. So for the most part it's always white and seconds, although occasionally it'll switch colors to red and show the number of hours, or green and show the number of minutes, and then the bottom half changes at that time in order to say if it's seconds, minutes, or whatever. Now that's all controlled by a custom C++ program that, honestly, the main routine at least is the same main program that we had 24 years ago. It's changed a little bit over the years, obviously, as the technology has changed, but the original concepts for this clock date back to the first years of our display. So one of the things that we do add is just the days before Christmas, is we add some strobes around the outside. And what you can see, these strobes basically are just have they're almost like little pixel strobes that are in there. Not even sure if you could get them anymore. The company that made these is now defunct as far as I know. But they are quite nice, and they've worked for, I don't know, 4 or 5 years that we've had them, I think. And they've held up okay. You can see, like, this one here is starting to get some condensation inside of it, right? But we only keep them out for just a day or two before Christmas, and then we'll keep them to New Year's, and then we'll take them off, and then they flash when the clock hits 0. And also the clock, when it goes 0, goes to an all orange color, but then certain pixels start to flash as well. So between that and the strobe, it makes it look like a really, really nice effect. I'm not gonna take the control box apart for this one. I will for some of the others, but what you can see is right down there at the very bottom is the clock control box, and all that's in there is a very old Alpha Pix 4 again, that is sending the signals out, right, to each of the different proxies. So probably an interesting thing to note is that the top half of this is 12 volts and the bottom half is 5 volts. So inside that box down there, in addition to having one controller, there's also a number of different other elements that are there. So we need 3 power supplies, 3 of which are 5 volt, 1 of which is 12 volts. These guys right here are also 12 volts, if I remember correctly. So they come off of one port of the controller as well and plugged into the 12 volts. But it's one controller that wasn't designed to feed to feed 2 different voltages. So what we do is just connect the data and the ground, because data is always the same voltage regardless if it's 12 or 5 volts. So we use that one controller for each, and then we power inject the power. So you can see, like right here, this is where power is being injected, and then it's going across to an injection point where it then is coming down with the thicker wire and running into a power supply. So then sitting on top of that, inside of there is just a speaker that projects our music out in addition to our radio, and then sitting on top of that is a security camera. You can also see the back side of our Snowmen here, and our Snowmen are actually kind of interesting. So we have two boxes that are out here. These are the power supplies behind them. So the Snowmen are entirely 5 volts, and honestly we would use 5 volts for everything. All of our new stuff is 5 volts, some of the older stuff is 12. So inside of there are power supplies for this half of the Snowmen, and then on this side is the power supplies for the other half of the Snowmen. And then this particular controller right here is an F16 controller, which I forgot to open the... Now, kind of an interesting design choice. You'll notice that this one here has a power supply built into it. This power supply only supplies power to the board, nothing else. So I got this as a used controller. So because clearly you saw that the boxes I build are not professional. This one was obviously quite nice, so I went ahead and kept it that way. But we don't do anything except for power the board off of this power supply and then power inject. So this is actually even a 12 volt power supply, while everything else here is 5 volts. So again, there's a wire that's kind of connected the ground for them together, but that's about it. So that the ground of the controller and the grounds of all the power supplies are connected together. But you can kind of see that, like, here's power coming up, and then here it kind of splits off into a couple different spots, and that's really a power injection. We do power injection as well as power balancing to make sure that every color is the same, whether you're in the beginning of the strand or the end of the strand. So one thing you may notice with our show is that if we look at the front here, it's a lot easier to see. This side of the screen is 1 inch, and then the whole rest of this is 2 inches. It's offset like this because everything has to be exactly aligned. So we actually have to power this up when we're aligning it, so that as the hand come across, it looks exactly like where the snowball is going across, and then coming over to the other side. This is all just held up by some some galvanized pipe that's hanging up there, and then we have pulleys that we can use in order to heave up the pixels and in order to line them up so that everything looks correct. So all right, so now we're kind of on the back side. You can kind of see what I'm saying is we basically, here our power goes nowhere, and then we're just connecting our grounds. Now normally you would see that this is coming in and also with power, but power is not actually grounded here. That's what this wire is. So this wire here, if you'll notice, is tying the two grounds together, and so this is actually linking over here to where this is injecting into the power supply, so that way we have a consistent ground, even though this is coming in from our 5 volt this is coming in from, yes, our 5 volt controller, but these are 12 volt pixels. The grounds are tied together between the 5 and the 12 volt power supplies. All right, so if we look over at our yard is a bit of a mess here, but what you can see is our stars that light up in the yard are nothing more than corrugated plastic. This is from Holiday Coral, and those stars basically have little tiny stars in them with a bunch of dumb pixels inside, so meaning that every single one is the same color. And those dumb controllers are scattered across the yard in a box like this, and then just look like a regular old power supply. Or sorry, a regular old circuit board. Those are just dumb controllers with 9 channels each. And then one of these boxes, one of those way back over there, has power, and then brings power, kind of comes in through this white wire right here. And then this has 4 wires in each of the black wires that are here, going to each of the stars and controlling whether or not the star, or controlling what color the star is by how much red, green, and blue is mixed together for the entire star. So, dumb pixels. Now, the trees are actually smart pixels. And as you might expect with so many different trees, the way that these are wired together is linearly. So each one is a run, and then this row is a run, and it just kind of goes in and jumps around to that one and jumps around to the next one. And then if we come over here, what we have is we have inside here a power supply, and you might not be able to see it sitting on top, but sitting on top of the power supply is one of our expansion boards just sitting there. That plugs all the way into our Falcon Pi player, or sorry, that plugs all the way into an old F-16 as well. So, and that's pretty simple. Do have a few more other power supplies. So in this particular case, this is just a power supply just for the mini trees up in here and in this row, and the only thing that's in there is a power supply, because we're not afraid of power injection. So this little box here does hide one of our speakers, so nothing too exciting there. If we come over to our tunnel of lights, what we can see is, number one, our grass is completely dead. But what we'll see is you're completely surrounded by pixel strands. And so the back is 1 inch spacing, and it's 8 foot across. So these are 2 from Boscoyo that are the 1 inch spacing that have been brought together, right? And then these are the 2 inch spacing. And only reason we're using 2 inch spacing here and on the sides is just because the cost, but it looks really nice having the 1 inch spacing in the back. And then everything is lined up in X lights with 3D, so you can kind of maybe see, it might be hard to see in the day, but the effects do a fairly good job of going around the corners and everything else to look like it's one unit. Those are controlled by, and they're not part of the main show, so those are controlled by a separate Falcon Pi player. I will show that in a minute. On this side, we do have an information board that's not turned on at the moment, but again, a P10, and then this one up here is our P5, which is keeping track of, or at least displaying, the number of times the buttons have been pushed. So 37,000 times so far this year. It also keeps, so every single button push that's here, which when you push a button changes the pattern that's happening in the background. All right, so there's our naughty or nice pattern, and each of those button pushes is being registered into a database, and so every so often we collect the stats and update the stats both on our website, and then every 2 minutes it displays it on that board, and most of the time it's displaying an information message, but then it uses the overlay possibilities from a Falcon Pi player to overlay that. So like that text right there is being overlaid even though a sequence wasn't there. We can see that 2 buttons are pressed. That was just me doing it within the last or today, and then it also tells us what button's the most popular. So I must have pressed white a couple times or whatever color popped up. So, and if I press it 10 more times, we'd have 38,000 views. So the buttons, I can link to how these are done. This is pretty simple. You can buy this complete package online, and I will link the name of it, but you can see right here it's from Experience Lighting. So looks good. The only trouble that we've had with these is that when it rains, the water does get in there, and then it freezes. And it freezes not only in that, but it also will sometimes get in the switch and freeze inside the switch. So I have a spare set of switches and of buttons that I will sometimes just swap out and then bring this set inside to dry. Sometimes it can, if it wasn't too bad, I can just take a heat gun and heat up this area a little bit to get it to drain, and that actually works. But we can see that this is just running a Cat 5 cable all the way back to our Pi player. And then on the back side, you can see here that we again have these strands are, because this is running at 40 frames per second, this is 80 pixels per strand, and with again lots of lovely power injection. So here's power coming in and then splitting off and being injected a number of spots throughout there. We are injecting every 100 and both directions, so that power will run backwards as well as running forwards when it injects, and that helps out with the color balance. We're not running these at full intensity, so we probably don't have to have it quite that much injection, but I found it always best to be safe rather than sorry, and really tend to over inject on power. And I think that's helped our pixels last a lot longer, if I'm going to be honest about it. So you can see here, here's where the end of a strand is, just put a cap in there, and then here's a new one coming in. So this is port 26 that's coming in here and then feeding down for a little while that way. And the frame is made out of wood. It's been painted black and kind of bolted together. We use a large number of straps in order to just ensure that with wind and everything else, it doesn't collapse upon itself. You'd be surprised, even given the amount of holes that are here, that with huge amounts of wind, this really pushes hard against it and can actually be quite a force. So we know that the hard way. About 2 years ago, my wife and I were putting it up, and we're not using ratchet straps, and didn't even really think about the amount of pressure it would be under. But those go down to anchors that go down 16 inches into the ground. So this thing's not going anywhere even under a good storm, which is good because people are standing under it. So if we look back here, we'll see a little bit of our mess. So in this big box here is nothing more than power supplies, right? And so these are power supplies for the entire tunnel that goes across. And you can even see examples of like where every strand, even when we get to the end of something like here, we don't just stop. So there was still pixels left, so we go clear to 800 on every single port. So you can see that this green wire is what's kind of jumpering from one to the other, so that we could get some of the remaining pixels in on the second sheet that's there, but then still be able to take it apart to be able to easily roll them up individually. So those are power supplies. No real reason to look at that. We'll look inside of some power plugs in a minute. This is the heart of this controller, of the setup. So what we have here is a BeagleBone Black with a Culp controller. So this is the 32 port version of it, and you can see that we are pretty much using every single port. I believe there's one spare port on this right now. And again, this gives you a really good example where you can see our patented holes. So this is just sitting on the ground. Normally we do put these under like a block or something, but this one's just been sitting on the ground all year, no problems. Gives a little bit of breathing air if it needs to come in, and if water does get in, it can quickly kind of drain out because it's in the very lowest pot of this. And then this just sits here with a lid on it labeled, and then this sits like this, just to ensure that try to keep as much rain as we possibly can off of it. And it sits there all year just like that. We don't have any problems. That box is just empty. You can see that some of the control points are actually sitting under it, but again, that's not really required. These ones here are just sitting out and getting rained on or snowed on, and they're completely fine. So, and we can see that this goes all the way around, and there's a strap down on this side as well. So now you might have noticed that the green wire from back there comes through here but didn't stop there. It actually goes back over to that box, and the reason being is that is a Beagle Bone Black, and the cape head that comes on top of that one actually only fits on the Pi player. So there is a very small, very old Pi 3 sitting back in that box behind the MegaTree that actually sends the message from what button's being pressed, and it basically all it's doing is it's not running any programs, but every single time a button is pressed, it fires off an MQTT event, and that MQTT event gets picked up by a couple things. It gets picked up by our stats server, so we know that the button's been pressed. It also gets picked up by our scheduler system. We do use a very custom scheduler program that so we don't use the scheduler inside a Falcon Pi player for anything. So the scheduler system is written in Node.js, and it is behind. So every time that it sees like an event come in where someone presses the button, it will use the API to call this particular box and to change the pattern that's being done based on the button that was been pressed. And each button does about 5 or 6 different patterns for the most part. But it's also the same Node.js application that's running our show. So that's constantly monitoring the MQTT traffic from our main player, and as well as this one here. And then whenever a song stops, it detects the song's not running anymore. What it does is it basically will call the API to schedule the song. So we'll do a little bit on the software at the end of this, but that particular one, it will schedule not only the tunnel, but also schedules the main show. It also schedules the Snowmen. It also schedules what you're seeing here on our primary information board, etc. So if I look at our MegaTree, this is probably one of the most interesting designs that someone would go, why in the world would you ever build it like this? It's because we didn't. So this was designed, this is actually, this MegaTree here is we bought used and brought it up here to northern Ohio from Kentucky, and it's designed where that pole should be sunken down in the ground, and ideally that wrench or that strap, which is kind of covered in black there, plastic, just to keep it shielded from the weather, would be something you could reach. But obviously we can't reach it without a lift truck or a ladder, so it's a little bit too high. That's because we didn't sink this pole in the ground, but rather just put it in a concrete bucket, which has worked pretty good, to be honest. So a little bit different design. Obviously, if I were to do this again, I would do this something where I could still reach the crank and be able to crank this down to the ground if we needed to do repairs. But honestly, when we've had pixel failures, they've been pretty easy to just fix with a ladder because this tree is not crazy tall. So inside of here is, again, an old F16 controller, so maybe a V3, I think, maybe, and some power. And then that extra Pi is plugged in here, as well as a network switch. So there's a network switch here that all of the items, such as the main information board out front, the information board that was on this side of the display, that Falcon Pi player here, and this F16 here, all plug in, so we only have one data line that's running back, and then we have power that's being run back. So pretty simple, really. Not going to take that one apart. I'll show you what one of my standard ones looks like when we walk over to the other MegaTree. Doing some outlines, probably our only unique trick to outlines, is I'm really happy we came up with, is we're just using the same strip that you normally would use for MegaTrees here for their outlines. But then what we do is we take in some rigid pipe. So in all of the cases just PVC, but gray PVC, and there's cable tied that to the pole, and then that makes it way easier when we go to hang up the pole each year, is that we just put some of the plastic strap or plastic clips up on top, hang it across the pole across, and then we learned this trick where we put these behind. I don't know if you can see it in the dark, maybe if I don't know, hopefully I'll be able to see them, but we put those up there, and that keeps it from, if there's a gust of wind, from wanting to flip back up, so to flip up on the roof. So keeps it really secure even within a really nice storm. We then of course have our roof elements. Nothing real special about those. Those elements are just on a long piece of wood. It's 16 inches, and then each one can be taken off. You might be able to see that there's holes underneath them, and you can just screw them, unscrew them, and then unplug them to take them off. And then they're all powered from one single 5-volt power supply. Those are 5 volts. And then there also is inside there one of the extension boards that are there, and then that's all plugging into our main FPP controller for this grid that we have up here, and that's it. This is by far our biggest and heaviest element. Well, maybe not. Probably that grid's really the biggest and heaviest one, but this is our biggest and heaviest element, or sorry, information board. And you can see that this is built with 4x6, which there's no reason this should have ever been built by 4x6. I'll actually link in a video of us taking this apart earlier this year to repair it if you want to see it. Yeah, so it's just basically got a Falcon Pi player behind there with the octo scroller top on it, so that we control our P10 panels that are in front. And I should have said that's how all of our information boards work, is with octo scrollers. Even our P5 is using octo scrollers, although that may be an interesting choice because we are pushing the limits at 40 frames per second there. That box right there is nothing but a power supply that's used to inject power for the entire outline that's going across, and it's getting all of its signals from the controller that's in the top of this. That box on the bottom is empty. It's just there just to raise things up a little bit, make it easier to work on. And then inside of the top here are some power supplies that are used for the bushes that are in front, and then this one here is a F16 one. So that's the third of our F16s that we had. Those were our standard before we started flipping over to the Falcon Pi players. I really do like the Falcon Pi players. So what that means is that we use multi-sync for things like the grid up here, which is controlled by a Falcon Pi player, as well as for that side of the house, which we'll look at, is called FPP window for some reason, but we'll look at that one and we'll see that those are multi-sync. But then the rest of these here were F16s. There's a main Pi inside the house. It's the primary one that does nothing but pushes data out to the MegaTree, the F16 here, that F16 in the yard, etc. So our bushes here are Holiday Coro, and that's not what the HC stands for. That's actually the HC means which power supply is plugged in. So our power supplies are labeled. So the ones for the bushes are HA, HB, HC. So what we can see here is these are the Brilliant bulbs from Holiday Coro. You can see a number of these have caps off of them and tape over them because these things fail every year and they stick on a particular color. So what I do is, if they're not completely busted, I will, just for the year, we'll take the cap off, put black tape on them, and then one of the things we do every single summer is go through and replace the ones, cut out the bad ones and put a new one. So you can see that this particular one, there's 1, 2, 3 that have gone bad this year alone, right? So I'll have to cut them out and splice in new ones, just like what was done here. Nothing too special about these. You can see that it's kind of pulling a bit down on the bush that used to be back up a little bit higher, and but with all the heavy rain and snow, it kind of shake the bush down a little bit. But I do use this just to make sure that every single one is the same length, so same numbers of up and downs. That way we get the effects that we're looking at, that they actually look exactly like what we would expect. If we look back at the window that are there, you can see that we have 4 windows that are made out of this. So this basically is the old clear plastic from Boscoyo. They don't sell it anymore because it does not hold up overly well to the weather. So the Snowmen used to be the same way. So you can see that the 2 Snowmen are actually black on the outside, the 1 inch, and it used to be the white 1 inch, but the UV protection is only on one side, so those actually wore out quite quickly, and in a strong wind it actually decapitated both of the Snowmen. So we ended up having to replace those. But because this is facing the inside, and I think because this has a fairly strong frame, we've not had as much of a problem with it. We've had to put a couple patches in place over cracked areas where we just cut out kind of like a little square and push it over on top, just to strengthen it a bit. But hopefully they got a few more years left in them. And then what you can see, those are 5-volt pixels, and then that's a copper frame that's been measured and soldered together. And then we could basically just put it up, put it in place, and then you can see that there's a couple of screws that go into our brick, that actually those stay there the entire time. And then the steel cable coming across has like a loop on it, so I can kind of take off the little U-bolt on the edges there, and then when we take them down, we could just take off that little U-bolt that's there, and then the whole thing will just kind of come down. When it's time to put up, we put it back in there, slap the straps over, and it holds it in place quite nice. So the Snowflakes are Holiday Coro Snowflakes. Those things have been here for quite a very long time. Those are 12-volt, and those are the only things we have that have the old square pixels in. So I'll put a picture here right alongside so you can see the square pixels. They held up decent, way better than these guys here, which fail every year. But we did have to, this past summer, go through and replace a number of pixels. And this particular snowflake here, there's 4 of them. But this one here does have 1 pixel that has failed already. Not sure if you can still get the spare or the square pixels anymore, but we have a number of spares still left over, and we just cut them out and kind of replace them in. So tire bushes are kind of done the same way, as you can see, just different ways of kind of strapping it on here. So this one's got a pole that goes down the back, and again, we are totally not afraid of power injection here. Everything is power injected. You can see that this one here is where power is being injected, and then this right here is actually going into a power cable that's running back to a power supply, which is behind those bushes. We would take a look there. But quick little disconnect if we need to take it apart and plug it back in. Everything's labeled, which is what that blue label is, so that I know what it's for. And then you can see up here a little bit of a mess. So this frame that this big grid is in is a professional frame that they use for staging. We purchased those, so it was quite an investment, but we've had it now for, I believe, 6 years, maybe more. and it was probably the best investment we ever had, because we used to use just galvanized 2-inch pipe, and that was pretty sketchy to say the least. So you can see there's just still a piece of pipe that we use going across the top up there, and that's mostly just to ensure that the two don't lean in and gives us a little bit of balancing while we're putting it up there. But then we have the steel cables coming down to all the sides. So there's like a one that's low height here, and then there's one that goes clear to the top, and they're on the back side, they're on the fronts. Same thing we see on this side. And then there's rope that, if we look back here, you could probably see that there's that rope that's going back and pulling it up against the house, just to make sure that it doesn't fall forward in the event of a really big windstorm or anything like that. But usually the wind's coming directly at the house and pushing it towards the house, which is why we have these two big ones up in front that are going back. It took me a couple years to think of this trick, but we actually use zip ties once we got it to the right spot to just tie it off, and just to make sure that they don't, by shaking, don't back up too far. And because you do get vibration on this with the wind, and I did notice that it would back out slowly. So like every weekend I would come out and tighten things up a little bit, and then I finally got the idea to put cable ties in, and that works really, really well. So and again, this grid was the second element that we ever built. These are that are pixel based. These are 12-volt pixels. This thing is quite old. A lot of things I would have done differently. So this is all now one sheet, so there's no way to take it apart without cutting wires and everything else, which makes it super heavy. So I will link in some videos there on, you know, how we construct things if we want to see those. But you can see that there's a pole going across the, or sorry, you can see there's another one of these support bars going across the top that's designed to not have any flex at all, with all those triangles in it. Those are awesome. Makes it super easy to take the thing up and down. And then we use bungee balls off to the side to try and keep it nice and taut and looking good. We first would cable tie it to that, but that turned out to be a really bad idea, because when the wind would push really, really hard, there was zero flex and it would start to rip through the plastic. So using bungee balls has been a really good choice for this, because it keeps it taut going across the top. And then as the bungee balls wear out after one, maybe 2 seasons, we just end up replacing them, and it kind of springs back without having any rips in the plastic that's there. Now I brought up that these are really, really old because this is when we didn't really understand the value of power injection. So there are, for just those 4,000 pixels there are 4 power supplies here, and there's another 4 power supplies in the bottom of that box over there. We don't need that many power supplies, but we didn't really know what we were doing. We still haven't changed it. The only thing that we did change is there used to be 2 alpha pixels, one that did this half of the grid and one that did that half of the grid. And now there's just one F16 controller, the same F16 called K8, that does this whole grid. So there's if we looked inside of this box right here, there's an expansion board that's here, so that there's 4 ports that come up and do this side. That one's got 4 ports that come up over there. And then there's another expansion port. You can see that green wire going there that goes up onto the roof and controls the 4 ports, although we only really use 3 of them for the items up on the roof. So if we come back over here, we can see, so this is one of our boxes that I've taken apart. So this is that F16 that I was just sorry, the Culp 8 that I was just talking about, that's here. So if I spin it around, you can see that we have some of the ports that are in here, and then we have these kind of injection ports right here that are used to feed other elements. So this one here is actually controlling everything on this side, the windows, these guys, these bushes, and then there's the one down on the bottom that actually controls all of those, plus sends the DMX signal out to this guy right here, all the little stars that are out there, and all those little control boxes like that one that we saw earlier. So this is our so we have two boxes here, and you can see this is pretty much how we set up our elements. So we basically have some boxes of power supplies that are in there, and then a cupboard. This is the lid for this one here, FPP window. So I just took it off so we could just see inside, but normally there's a lid in here, and then underneath is just another power supply that's in there. But so I will put the lid back on when we close it up, and that's good. Then you can see that on this side the outline is super tall. So in this particular case we're using fence post. So this particular fence post is tied to the plastic poles. So the plastic comes apart in sections that are about 10 foot or 8 foot maybe. That way makes it easier to fold and manipulate. And then this steel pole right here, we basically is what we use. It's very, very rigid, so we can get the outline leaning up against the garage. And then we just need a couple spots at the top to kind of pull the steel cable in, and we get it looking like it's all nice straight line. Even though right here you can see it's leaning in, you don't notice that at nighttime at all. You can see here if we walk over this way, so you can see here this is an example of one of our power supplies and that are just laying out in the yard. The tape is there just to make sure the lid stays on. There's also a brick underneath that, as you can kind of see, and that brick keeps it off the ground so that if any water does happen to get it, you see there's water sitting on top, that it would drain through the little holes that are there. Still gives it room to breathe. Not had any problems with this design at all. So we skipped a lot of boxes, but this is what our standard box looks like, as you might see. So again, here we can see we have power coming in, and then that's being split off in order to feed our different power supplies here. If I look at a power supply, you can see that it's labeled. We can see that it's fused, and then those lines just directly run out like here into the MegaTree. And then here actually on the ground is where it splits into those little colorful cables, and that's what's actually bringing in the power injection. And then these are all daisy chains. So this is only a 4-port controller. So you can see that the very small wire coming in to power this controller, and that's because we're not using the power off of the controller at all. We're just using this to power the board. Everything else is power injected. So again, another one of our Holiday Coro Alpha Pix 4 controllers. They're good controllers, but we're slowly replacing them as we need more capacity in a certain part of the house. Definitely wouldn't buy any new ones. I would totally buy all Falcon Pi players at this point in time. So much more flexible things you can do. But you can see that we'll have a couple power supplies in one of these, power point, and then we'll end up putting maybe a controller in here, and then we'll have a lid, and then we'll put this board on top, and then we'll have a brick on top, and that's just to keep all the rain from coming through. So with that, I think we've seen pretty much everything there is to see from our display. You can see that this older MegaTree, which uses one of those Holiday Coro toppers, you can see that this really needs to be replaced. The pole is bending a little bit. use a lot of steel cables to keep it up there. That steel cable is taut. At least if that pole were to break, it'd be very easy to get a replacement. And then we use, here we're basically just using nails and using some bungee balls. And you can see that these balls are getting the bungee strap's getting a little loose here and probably needs to be replaced, because some of those are a little bit loose, but as is the end of the season, won't do that this year. But that's really it for kind of a behind the scenes tour of everything you have here. If you have any questions, drop them in the comments, and be happy to try and answer them as best as we can. We'll take a quick look at the inside and our software stack before we close out this video. There's nothing too interesting about the inside of our house. So here's where all the wires are coming in, where we have power and data signals kind of coming in. We run all of our powers through this box right here, which measures the current that we're drawing. I got a special video on that, which I will link in, and that allows us to show in real time how much power we are consuming. And then we talked about the donate light having its own Wi-Fi switch, so there it is. So when that's on, that supplies power to this as well as to our speakers. So we can see here that is what's actually controlling our speakers. That's there. Every other wire is nicely labeled and plugged into one of our numbered ports. And those number of ports, we can actually monitor in real time for every single port how much power is being consumed. So if I come in here, then the other thing that we have here is all the network wires run over to this side, where we can see right here, that's the main show player, just a very old Raspberry Pi 3 that's plugged in. And then this is our dedicated show network. We have our own dedicated VLAN for Christmas lights with proper firewalls. So that would actually plug into this guy right here, which is our primary router for the house. But then this Christmas VLAN, you can see, goes off to a number of different spots, most of which are outdoors, a few of which are indoors, including our Pi player here. And then here's the audio cable coming into a splitter, one of which goes up there, which is a little hard to maybe see, but that is our radio station right there. So it's just right at ground level. It's not super high in the air. And then the other cable is this one here, running over to where we saw it there a little bit. So that's pretty much the inside. Now let's go look at the software stack.
So one of the things that makes our show so unique is that there's a lot of interactivity. So we have a website right here where you could vote for the next song. So for example, if I'm really interested with Dominic the Donkey, I could vote this up, and it shows me I have 5 votes available. And then once my song plays, and I don't have to put them all on one vote, so maybe I could also increase like Sugar Plum Fairy. And then once my song plays, I get those votes back and could basically vote again. Um, we have that capability. We have the ability to receive names that can kind of come in, and those get displayed on our main screen up here. We then have statistics that are captured, such as, the uh, would have been the most voted songs. So, for example, that's in the last 15 minutes. Those are the votes I just did over a 24-hour period. Over the year, we can vote on Snowmen to say which of the Snowmen we want to have up there. You can see that Buddy the Elf's been fairly popular this year. We keep track of most played songs. What are some of the most requested names? So this year, Matt and Emily have been the 2 most requested names at the top. And then we also keep track of the buttons that get pressed throughout in front of the tunnel to see those are happening. And then we kind of have an idea of how many people have interacted with our display. So this year we've had around 2,000 unique sessions that voted on a song and around 1,400 unique phone numbers that texted a name to our display. So how all this works is pretty much documented on our website. So this particular page we're looking at is the text our name, but it shows a general kind of architecture that we tend to have in place. We have a web server, which is interface for our Twilio account, which basically when you text to our display's phone number, it goes through Twilio and then it calls an API on our web server. But that web server also hosts this voting page that we were looking at before, where I could see the statistics and I could also see what songs that I might want to be able to vote for. Um, and then what that does is every time a vote comes in or a new name gets added, etc., it publishes that on an MQTT server. The MQTT server is actually behind the firewall. Kind of looks like it's bridging it, but it really technically is behind the firewall with a VPN up to our web server to allow specific traffic to feed through. And then from that information, when a name, like for example, comes in, we display it immediately under the countdown clock and then queue it to be displayed up here. So that name will be picked up by the countdown clock. It'll also be picked up by the server that runs an Xlight's rendering component and holds the master queue list of names that need to be sent in. And then as soon as it's ready for generating of that, what we'll actually see is it'll generate the names list. Sorry, it'll generate a new sequence and load that sequence up to the Falcon Pi player. So if and then the only other thing that's not shown on here, but's part of it, is our stats server. So there's a stats server that listens for every single MQTT message. It writes that MQTT message to a database like we saw earlier. And then when that information is, so every so often, about every 2 minutes, it takes a summary of that information and then sends an MQTT message out with the summary so that it could be displayed on our stats page as well as it gets displayed right above the tunnel, at least the information on the total number of unique button presses and stuff gets displayed there. It's also the we saw before about the power information. So the power information is also displayed here. So again, if I were to flip down to the page and look under the information board, there's much more detail about how that works, where it basically shows some of the pictures with the Arduino Uno, or sorry, it's Arduino Mega, and how the sensors work. And then, of course, there's actually behind the scenes video talking a bit about all the software control and everything else. So in addition to having a user interface, we also have an admin interface. So this particular one allows us to see all the names that have historically come in. Ones that were in red are ones where the system didn't parse a valid name. Um, so you can see like here, these are three names that kind of came up, and then you can see in square brackets what it actually identified as real names. The system uses the IRS database of first names in order to figure out what to parse out. You know, sometimes people send us some rather odd things that we have to keep out. So example here, can you send me a picture of my name? It actually was trying to parse that out and actually thought that can, me, my, and name were all valid names. So apparently there's at least 10 people who have the name, first name of name in the IRS database, which is kind of interesting. But if we have one that we want to go ahead and improve, we could just go ahead and hit add, and then it would allow us to add it to the list or put it in the first of the list. and then it'll also text them back to say that, hey, it's going to be added. The history basically kind of gives us information on all the historical messages that admin has sent out via a text phone number. And then we have an info tab here that allows us to see different information that we have here. So we could change the show status. We could make it skip the time check so it runs more than just the normal hours. We use that for debugging sometimes. We can do the same thing. We put like the clock in debug mode so that it runs a special pattern that we saw when we were hanging the snowman for aligning things up, etc. There's quick links here to all of our different controllers. If we need to go out and do a change on those, as all those pretty much have web interfaces. And then we have some other tricks that we can do. So, for example, if it's somebody's birthday, um, we could put in their first name and submit it, and that'll make the next song a special birthday wish to them. And I can also basically use a power to play whatever song I want as the most immediate next song. So if I were to submit Peanuts, that would force this to be the next song that gets displayed. So here's the console of our main server, which does a lot of the rendering as well as runs this clock software. So this particular window here is basically the one that is running both the countdown clock and the snowmen, as well as the information board that displays the real-time power. So as you can see here, it's basically just displaying a little bit of information on the screen so we can debug it. This is a custom C++ program, which is linked into which you can get see the code right off of our website. The other one that we have is down here at the bottom. You can see that a name just kind of came into the queue, and that should have been Matt, not at, but I could also remove it from the queue if I wanted to. So I just removed the name at, and actually could put in Matt. But then what happens is that once the system has reached some threshold, so every 10 minutes or so, um, or if it gets a total of 13 names, it'll go ahead and it'll generate a sequence. So what it's going to do is it's going to take those 13 names and generate a list, and then it's actually manually updating a file within Xlights and running Xlights right here to render that sequence out. And you can see it's called wish name. And so what it's doing is it's rendering that sequence now after all the names have been substituted into the file. And then what it's going to end up doing is as soon as this finishes rendering, it's then going to upload that sequence to all of our Falcon Pi players so that they have the updated sequence. And then it's going to schedule it within our scheduler so that if we were to look at the names off of our main website, we can see that the next song that's going to be played is going to be these and going to have those names that were requested. So hopefully that gives you a little bit of a feeling of how our software stack works. You can see that the source code for everything is available on GitHub. So that's our main scheduler in Node.js, our name checker, which is basically the API that handles coming in for Twilio, our statistics, our Vote-Now website, etc. And you could use all of those in order to, if you wanted to, look at the code to see how they work. So with that, thank you very much for following us on this tour or behind the scenes at Christmas at the Hormans.